Hello and welcome to another Mr. Carter Science Specials. This video focuses on the AQA GCSE Biology Course, Chapters 18.10, Food Security. As always, keep your eye open for the learning outcomes and the syllabus references as we go through the video. So today we're going to be looking at different factors that affect food security. And just as a beginning image, this image here that we're looking at was taken during the 1984 Ethiopian famine, very famous famine. Band-Aid, the song Feed the World, all came from this particular famine in an effort to try and help the people of Ethiopia when they were badly affected by a famine, and this came due to a lack of food security in their country. So what kind of factors can cause a country or an area to have a lack of food security and to be affected by a lack of food sources for the population? Well, food security is having enough food to feed the population. And in order to have enough food to feed the population, sufficient food must be grown. People must have access to the food they need, either by growing or purchasing their food. People must eat a balanced diet, and this will avoid any deficiency diseases such as scurvy, kwashiorkor, or even starving. Or in fact, the exact opposite is also true. It must be a balanced diet, so we're going to try and avoid eating too much. For example, diseases that you can get from having too much might be type 2 diabetes or heart disease. Without sufficient food, people will suffer malnutrition. They may even starve to death, as happened in Ethiopia in 1984. So, what factors will affect a country's ability to provide food and food security? Well, the first big factor is an increasing birth rate. In many developing countries, the birth rate is increasing, but at the same time, the death rate is falling due to better sanitation, better healthcare, etc. And this is leading to an increase in the population size. For example, here we can have a quick look at this classic stages of a demographic transition graph, and you can see that if we have a high birth rate and death rate, we get a stable population size. If we get a low birth rate and death rate, again you get a stable population size. But if there is a difference between the birth rate and death rate, a high birth rate and a low death rate will lead to an increase in the population size. So why is it in these developing countries the birth rate is still high, even though the death rate's falling? Well, there's two basic reasons for this. There are practical reasons and cultural reasons. The practical reasons are that people know some of their children will die, so they have a large number of children in order to replace those that will die before they reach the age of 5. Another reason is that those children are needed to work the land and help the parents to farm and have agriculture on the land that they own. Children are also needed to support the parents in old age. Often these are countries without a welfare system, where there isn't a pension system, where there isn't good healthcare. So when you get to your old age and you're unable to work, you need to rely on your children to support you. So the more children you have, the better off you'll be in old age. There are also cultural reasons why the birth rate will still be high. And this could be that large families are a sign of respect. So if you have a large family, then people will respect you more within your community. And it could be for religious reasons. Several religions do not accept the use of contraceptives, and therefore birth rates will naturally be higher than they are in the Western world. But both of these practical reasons and cultural reasons lead to a high birth rate, and when that's coupled with a low death rate, we get a large population growth, and this population growth threatens food security. If there are more people in your population and the same amount of food, then each individual person will have less food to live on. Another factor that affects food security in many nations is the changing diets in the West. In Western countries, people often look for new and interesting foods. These may be foods that they wish to use to show how culturally aware they are, or perhaps to reduce their intake of meat or fish. And for example, some of these new trendy foods are things like cassava from Brazil, or quinoa, which comes largely from Peru, or sorghum, which comes from sub-Saharan Africa. These are crops that are very good at being grown in the hot tropical regions, but not very good at being grown in the more temperate regions of the planet. And this can lead to several problems. Foods like cassava, quinoa and sorghum are transported around the globe to provide variety for people who already have plenty of variety of different foods to eat. And this transportation can increase carbon dioxide emissions, which can lead to global warming and climate change. But in the local economies in the producing countries, this will also drive up prices and deprive local people of valuable traditional food sources. The traditional diets are often replaced by modern foods such as pasta and chips and fries, or fast foods, and they often lack nutrients and are less balanced than the traditional food sources of the area. So food security is reduced as foods must be imported rather than grown. And you can see this shown in the graph here for quinoa produced in Bolivia. For much of the late 1990s and the early 2000s, there isn't much of an increase in the export of quinoa, but from about 2005 onwards, when quinoa becomes a very trendy food to have in the West, the exports massively increase, and about the same time the local consumption of quinoa decreases, even though the production has increased from the mid 1990s and then remains quite high but stable throughout the mid 2000s onwards. Another issue that affects food security are new pests and pathogens. Global travel, shipping of animals and seeds around the world, and climate change have led to an increase in pests and pathogens being transferred from one area to another. And this can cause disease in crops and cattle, leading to a decrease in the yield, the amount of crops and cattle that you can actually grow. And this reduces the amount of food available for people to eat, and so reduces the food security of an area. One example of this is blue tongue, and you can see that here with this particular cow. You can see his tongue has a bluish tint to it. British farmers must now deal with an increased risk of this blue tongue disease. And this is a disease that affects cattle, and the disease is carried by midges. These midges are spreading into Europe and Britain from Africa as the climate warms up. So this is a disease that 20 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, British farmers just didn't have to deal with because the midges could not survive in the colder British conditions. However, due to climate change, we're now seeing more of these midges carrying this disease being able to survive in the conditions of Northern Europe and Britain. So crops and animal pests and disease are spreading from tropical regions to temperate regions and polar regions at a rate of 2.7 kilometers a year. That's incredible. Another issue that's affecting food security is environmental change. For example, here you can see the floods along the Indus River in Pakistan in 2010, absolutely devastating farmland, causing a large number of people to leave their houses and leave the land that they're tending, and the crops that are on that land are being destroyed, and therefore there's less food available to feed that population. Here you can see the area of Pakistan there, and just how much of that country was affected by these floods in 2010. Here's another example of environmental change affecting food security. Again from 2010 in Somalia, on the Horn of Africa here, we had a large famine and a drought that devastated all the farmland. Areas that should have been producing a large amount of crops to feed the population of Somalia were too dry to grow, and the crops died, and a large number of people were displaced and moved around the country in search of food because there was a lack of food security. So, in more detail, environmental change, possibly as a result of global warming, can have a big effect on food security. Plants and animals require stable conditions to grow and survive. Drought and flooding can have a devastating effect on food security. Both floods and droughts are increasing in frequency due to this climate change. As we've already seen, we have the example of a Somalian famine in 2010, where 260,000 people died when the rains failed and there was a 2-year drought, a lack of food security causing famine and death. In Pakistan, in their floods in 2010 and 11, large areas were flooded, causing the deaths of hundreds of people, many more suffering from malnutrition because the crops failed and rotted, causing an increase in food insecurity. The next factor that can affect food security is conflicts. Conflicts and wars can destroy infrastructure and damage the crops that are being grown. Access to clean water can be restricted, and this reduces food security and increases the cost of food, both in the conflict region and in the wider world. Concerns over food supply and water supply can actually also lead to conflict, and an example of this going on right now in 2020 and 2021 is in the Yemen, where again we have a large number of people suffering because of a lack of food security. There are huge cases of famine and malnutrition going on right now in this country because the crops are failing, because people can't tend the land, there's not enough water for people to drink, so there's a lot of disease and malnutrition going on in that country. And there's just one image here which encapsulates this, of a small girl who is dying from starvation due to a lack of food security within Yemen. So what's the solution? We need a sustainable solution. As the human population continues to increase, the need for sustainable food production increases. We must be able to produce food for the whole human population in a way that allows food to be produced for many generations to come. We need to be able to maintain soil quality so that plant crops can grow well year after year after year. We need to look at more effective ways to produce the food, more efficient ways to produce food as well. And we need to take care of our fish stocks so that we do not run out of fish and can maintain oceanic ecosystems. The Brundtland Commission in 1987 gave this definition of sustainability. We need to be able to understand how to meet the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future generations to meet their own needs. It's a complex issue, but if we do not begin to address it now, then a lack of food security will only increase in many areas of the world, affecting many millions of people. I hope you've enjoyed this video on food security for the AQA course. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying these videos, and thank you very much for watching.